Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for joining our Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences conversation series. My name is Nazem Chichek, and I'm the Associate Dean Research in the faculty. The title of today's seminar is Covering New Ground, Prairie Cover Crops Research. Before we get going, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba is located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So if you're new to the Faculty Conversation series, it is our virtual seminar series highlighting some of the innovative research that's happening in our faculty, hopefully in an engaging format. And if you missed our previous seminars, there's an opportunity to view them right here on our faculty's YouTube channel. And as another option, you can also find links to the seminars at our knowledge translation portal, which we call Manitoba Agriculture and Food Knowledge Exchange, or Make Manitoba. And makemanitoba.ca highlights our faculty's research as it relates to consumers and producers, with links to resources such as infographics, fact sheets, podcasts, and even some recipes. Okay, so today we have three speakers who will share with us a short summary of their research and then engage together in a conversation. You as a viewer can participate in this conversation by sending in your questions and comments via the chat platform Slido. Right now, if I can call on Crystal Jorgensen, our faculty's communications specialist, to provide some guidance on how the audience can participate in the presentation. Crystal?
Thanks, Nazem, and welcome to everyone who's joined us here today. We hope that you'll help us out with some questions for our speakers. And to do that, if you can, please open another browser window on your phone or on your other monitor and visit slido.com. Once you get there, you can enter the event code #covercrops, all one word. You can feel free to start asking questions at any time. And when we get to the Q&A, we'll try to get through them in chronological order. The question field is a little bit limited in the character count, so try and keep your questions succinct. And to kick it off, I'd love to hear where people are tuning in from today. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Nazem, and we can revisit these instructions later on.
Okay, thanks, Crystal. So adapting farming practices to meet the emerging needs of food systems across the Canadian prairies generally motivates us to reimagine how we conduct research and train students here at the faculty and at the university. So our conversation today will explore some of these opportunities through the experience of three graduate students who have been working with Dr. Yvonne Lawley in the area of cover crops research within the Department of Plant Science. As you might know, cover crops are being grown by early adopters across the Canadian prairies. Recent programs like the On-Farm Climate Action Fund from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada have created many incentives for farmers to accelerate the adoption of best management practices which include cover crops. So the need for research and training in this area is rapidly growing. Okay, so today's conversation will explore some of the exciting research that's ongoing in this area and how it is connecting with a range of our stakeholders, from farmers all the way to policymakers, and the opportunities these connections have created to really enhance our student training experience within the faculty. Okay, so I'd like to now introduce you to our guests and start with Dr. Yvonne Lawley. Yvonne is an associate professor in the Department of Plant Science at the University of Manitoba, and her research is in agronomy and cropping systems. Dr. Lawley's research is focused on several crops, including soybeans, corn, and wheat, and a range of management practices from residue management, strip tillage, to cover crops. The research involves both small plot and on-farm field scale agronomy research. Dr. Lawley enjoys communicating the results of her work to a wide range of audiences, including farmers, agronomists, scientists, and especially in the classroom. Over to you, Yvonne.
Great, thanks for that introduction, Nazem. And I think that the invitation to participate in the faculty's conversation series is really appropriate for this research area and our experience that we're going to share with the graduate students that I've been working with in this area of cover crops, because I think it really is a conversation right now about how we can utilize this new tool of cover crops and adapt this tool for prairie cropping systems. So we'll start with just talking about what cover crops are. So we'll get everyone on the same page here for this conversation. Cover crops are not new, but what is new is the way we're thinking about using plants as a tool to manage soil. So cover crops are using plants to cover the soil rather than for the purposes of harvesting their grain. So sometimes we're using the same plants that we might grow for as a grain crop as a cover crop, or we might be using species that we don't normally grow as grain crops to grow and enhance and protect soil. What's really interesting right now is the way we're thinking about using cover crops. Cover crops have long been used in organic crop rotations as a green manure crop to try and fix nitrogen or to prevent soil erosion. If we think about, historical systems on the prairies when we had fallow in rotation, we were thinking about using cover crops to protect the soil there. Now, where we're continuously cropping on the prairies and growing crops every year in most places, we're thinking about intensifying those bookends of the shoulder season. So either after harvest or before seeding in the spring, using plants as a tool during that period of the year to protect the soil or enhance the soil, feed microbial communities, fix nitrogen, create more soil structure. We also see, if you look at the bottom picture on this slide here, where we might be growing cover crops for the full season, and it may be across an entire field or just in a part of the field. In this case, it was around a wet area of the field that was too wet for planting. So we can think about site-specific management with cover crops as well as growing them across an entire field. Cover crops are also interesting in Western Canada, where we have integration between crops and livestock. They can be a source of forage and feed for livestock. So just thinking about why we would want to use plants in this new way is the growing interest in having living plant cover. Again, this isn't new in that we've known for a long time, farmers in the prairies have known for a long time about the value of living plant cover, in that we know that, our soils, the legacy of prairie soils, soil health for those soils is largely a result of perennial crops in the grasslands that have helped build the chemical, physical, and biological properties of prairie soils that we know and enjoy. We also know farmers in the prairies have been utilizing winter cereals that help extend cover as grain crops. Increasingly, we're exploring intercropping, so growing more than one crop type at a time. And that intercropping can also help extend the period of time that we have living plants growing. So cover crops are really a concept that integrates with a lot of different practices that we see farmers turning towards to try and build soil health. And what's new about cover crops is that we would plant and manage those plants as a crop for that specific purpose. And I think it's an interesting time on the prairies to be talking about this goal of having living plant cover, in that we have many strategies to accomplish this, and where cover crops have really seen success and have been growing in uptake across Eastern Canada and throughout the US Midwest states in particular. We're still figuring out in Western Canada right now what is the fit for cover crops or these other strategies in trying to reach this goal of having living plant cover. So this is really an interesting time to be talking with farmers about this concept of living cover and cover crops, and how early adopters have started utilizing cover crops. It's a really interesting time to be a researcher, taking this concept of cover crops and trying to understand how we can adapt the agronomy to grow them well in our prairie cropping systems, and to see, how we can explore this management to better understand and better optimize this practice to achieve our soil health goals in Western Canada. So the context of cover crops for the prairies is pretty important and unique right now. We have a lot of environmental challenges that make this practice hard. We have, very short growing seasons, and we often have dry periods during the growing season that might make it hard to establish cover crops. Typically, the prairies are known for having dry falls and wet springs. And so those dry falls can make it hard to establish cover crops in the fall shoulder season. So our strategies for evaluating cover have to take these environmental challenges into consideration. We're at a period where we have a lot of early adopters working with cover crops and a growing interest and curiosity, but we still have, a lot of unanswered questions about how to optimize these systems. So there is really a growing need for knowledge networks, which as researchers, it's exciting to be a part of. As Janzen mentioned, we have some new cost share programs that have been introduced. And so these are really changing the landscape of creating some incentives for farmers and agronomists to start working with these, with this practice of growing cover crops. But we also have sort of this knowledge deficit and need to catch up in that we have a large training need. This is a new practice. And so agronomists who are working with farmers or farmers who are talking to each other are looking for information. And again, as a researcher, that's an exciting space to be in and an exciting environment to be working with and training students. So the context of cover crops on the prairies is really important and is influencing our conversation today about how we are doing research about cover crops at the University of Manitoba in my research group. So because there's so much to learn and so much to know, we decided to take a range of strategies. And so that's really where this conversation starts today, is talking about the different ways that we're doing research on cover crops and the different experiences and opportunities we've had to train graduate students. And I think this is really exciting and a good opportunity to rethink, what are these innovative practices that we can do as educators to train the students and the workforce that's needed to help farmers and agronomists tackle this new goal of utilizing cover crops for the prairies. So the research approaches that we're going to be talking about today involve everything from a survey that we did on how farmers are using cover crops and what benefits and challenges they're experiencing, to taking research to working farms. So we will hear from a graduate student, Dale Penner, who's been working with an on-farm research project. And then lastly, sort of the more traditional role of agronomic research, small plot research, where we can compare a lot of different treatments and learn a lot to feed back into on-farm research. And hopefully we'll learn more through surveys in response to the new knowledge that we're gaining through all of these practices into the future. So with that, I'd like to start having us discuss each of these different areas of research and also talk about the different opportunities we've had for graduate student training through the voices of the graduate students who've been living these projects for the last 3 years.
Okay, thank you, Yvonne. That's a perfect segue into our next section, and thanks for kicking us off with a great intro. So I'd like to welcome Callum Morrison, one of those graduate students that Yvonne just mentioned. And Callum is a part-time MSc student, master's student, investigating cover cropping on the Canadian prairies and in Ontario. And he also works as a crop production extension specialist for Manitoba Agriculture. So if I can hand it over to you, Callum.
Thank you very much for that introduction. As Yvonne has already said, my research has been a series of surveys on the prairies and then later in Ontario. And we really realized we needed to do a survey because we really needed to know what is happening with cover cropping on the prairies. As you know, that it's becoming increasingly popular. However, we really need that benchmark so that we know where we are and where we're going. So our survey had many objectives. The first one was we wanted to gain feedback on the current extent of cover cropping. So who are the farmers growing cover crops? What sort of farms do they have and where are they located? We wanted to identify how they're using cover crops. So really a bit about their agronomy and what windows for opportunity there are for cover cropping. We wanted to understand why they're growing cover crops, their goals. We wanted to determine what benefits farmers have experienced and in what time scale. We also wanted to look at the problems and challenges that farmers have faced. And also importantly, we also wanted to hear from farmers who hadn't grown a cover crop before so that we could try and understand the barriers to widespread cover crop adoption that exist on the prairies. And we also wanted to identify what could enable farms to grow cover crops in the future. Now, one thing that's important to understand about this project is at the beginning, we would have been happy if we would have heard from 50 farmers from within Manitoba. But it became quickly apparent that this survey needed to hear from a much wider range of farmers. Farmers were just so eager to add their voice and tell us about how they're using cover crops. And the response from industry and other stakeholders in the industry that we should put this out there was immense. And then also during COVID, it really gave me a unique chance when I was stuck at home to get really into this survey. So in the end, we ended up hearing from over 1,300 farmers. And this survey went from a Manitoba survey into a Prairie survey across the 3 Prairie provinces. And then the Ontario Cover Crop Steering Committee in Ontario invited us over there as well. So we did a survey there, in Ontario as well. So if we look at just the Prairie data, we heard from 528 farmers across the 3 Prairie provinces. 281 of those respondents grew a cover crop in 2020, and 247 of them didn't grow a cover crop in 2020. Now, those 281 farmers that grew a cover crop in 2020, roughly a third of them came from each province, actually. And that was one of the things that we found the most interesting about our survey was just the distribution. Because we found that farmers are actually integrating cover crops into their farms across a wide variety of locations, right the way up into the Peace District in northern Alberta, right the way down to the US border, in areas which we consider to quite often have moisture available in the fall, and in areas where it can become a lot more challenging with those moisture shortages in the fall for establishment. What we did find, interestingly, is that farmers in Manitoba that grew cover crops were most likely to establish their cover crop as a shoulder season cover crop, and then the proportion of shoulder season cover croppers decreased with each province we went west, and part of that could be due to the shorter growing seasons we're seeing in Alberta, and again the challenges with establishing cover crops in a dry fall season. One other thing trend we saw between the 3 provinces is as we went west, the proportion of farmers starting their cover crop as an intercrop increased, and that might be a way that we can get around those shorter growing seasons by allowing us to establish earlier, but also at a time when there's more likely to be some moisture. So that was something we found very, very interesting. Now, one thing which I loved about this survey is it gave someone like me who's come from Scotland just a few years ago the opportunity to hear from farmers right the way across 4 provinces, all the way from Grand Prairie to Ottawa, and from so many different types of farms, from whether they be livestock farmers, whether they be fruit producers, or whether they be large annual grain farms. It was a wonderful experience for me to be involved with. And also myself and the other students got to take part in a good deal of extension with getting our research out there to farmers. So I produced a report for the Ontario survey and a report for the Prairie survey, as well as a report for the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. And that went out to farmers, researchers, policymakers, and people who took part in our survey. and we created press releases. And in the end, we were featured in well over 100 different articles across Canada, including in newspapers. Some are local, some are provincial, some are national, and some, of course, are deeply agricultural. Others are more what we class as mainstream. And I think it was just a great project where we really got to engage with both the gathering of the data, but also getting it out and getting it in front of farmers and researchers, policymakers, so that they can really understand where we are with cover cropping in the prairies. And that's just a little short few-minute overview of my research journey, and I look forward to answering some of your questions.
That's great, Callum. What a fantastic experience. And the fact that you got that many responses from right across 4 provinces is amazing. So looking forward to the questions around that survey and the outcomes of it. So next up, we'd like to welcome Dale Penner. Dale completed his BSc in agronomy at the U of M and is currently an MSc student under Dr. Yvonne Lawley. Dale's research is exploring the agronomic and economic impacts of fall cover crops in on-farm trials across Manitoba. Dale is also involved in the research affiliate program with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, where he has expanded his research on the economic implications of cover crop adoption. Take it away, Dale.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. So yeah, I had on-farm research. So I was looking at the agronomic and economic impacts of cover crops across Manitoba. So we're looking at where cover crops are fitting into our farmers' annual crop rotations. We're measuring the growth potential of cover crops and determining the impact they have on those subsequent cash crops. And we're also looking at the impacts the cover crops have on the soil and the short-term economic impacts of fall cover crops. So here on this right-hand side here, we can see that the experiment layout. So we have 4 replicates that span the length of a quarter section. So these are very large plots we're dealing with, but we're only looking at 2 treatments. So we have the cover crop treatment and the control treatment. So in the control, this is just their conventional farming practices, where in the cover crop treatment, we're adding in those fall cover crops when possible. And the locations of our on-farm trials were spread out across Manitoba. So we had 2 sites in Western Manitoba, being Brandon and Cartwright, and then 4 sites within the Red River Valley, being Homewood, Roland, Rosenfeld, and Dominion City. Now, the benefits of having these multiple sites across Manitoba are that we're getting to see cover crops in different environments and on different soil types. And this is important for cover crops adopters or potential adopters that want to see cover crops reacting to similar soils and similar climate conditions as their own farm. And so for the measurements we're taking, the first area we're looking at is cover crop performance. So this is how much biomass the fall cover crop is able to produce in the fall, and the amount of ground cover it's producing. And then for the impacts on the subsequent cash crop, we're looking at primarily grain yield, but also grain protein. In this bottom left-hand picture here, we can see we're collecting the grain yield data from the combine, so it has harvested the entire crop of each treatment. And then for the impacts on the soil, we're looking at the soil fertility, soil moisture, soil temperature, and the soil health. And for economic impact, we're completing a partial budget analysis where we're looking at the additional costs of implementing cover crops on farms. And some of the key findings from our research was that we were seeing there is a window for seeding fall cover crops after crop harvest in the fall. And this is primarily after spring cereals or other earlier harvested cash crops such as canola. Those longer season cash crops like soybeans, that window is not likely there for post-harvest seeding. We did see some limited growth of the cover crops, especially in those dry years, but when we do get those fall rains, we were seeing some good amounts of biomass produced by the cover crops. And we did see some small yield penalties with the cover crop treatment. That was not major yield penalties, but there were there in some years. And this is for soil health, we did see some increases in the total score. So that's a promising aspect of cover crops. Even just after 2 or 3 years of growing cover crops, we're seeing an improvement in the soil health scores. And for the economic impact, we did see a fairly large cost of the practice. So therefore, we're going to need to find some strategies to minimize the costs. So for the impacts of our research, we were able to connect with those farmers participating in the trials, and also some other farmers. As we're able to observe the field scale trials, we're getting a better understanding of the real world challenges that our farmers are facing in Manitoba with adopting cover crops. And for our economic research, it's important to inform the potential adopters of the potential costs and benefits of the practice, while also helping guide future policies surrounding cover crop payments. And like Callum said, we had lots of opportunities to network and share our research. So we were able to connect with multiple policymakers and researchers and agronomists to hopefully better improve the future of cover crops in Manitoba and how they're managed. Now, for bettering the agronomy, Yvonne alluded to this, but this is where small plot research comes in and where Virginia's research takes over.
Hey, thank you so much, Dale. That was excellent. And I think on-farm research obviously has the kind of credibility that sometimes farmers really look for. And I think your results will be important going forward. But as Dale mentioned, we have one more speaker today. At the beginning, I said we had 3 speakers. I was wrong. We have 4. And our 4th speaker is Virginia Janzen. Virginia is also an MSc student under the supervision of Dr. Lawley. She completed her Bachelor of Science degree in agronomy at the University of Manitoba. And she recently began her position as the Regenerative Agriculture Program Coordinator, the Seine Roseau Watershed District. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, Virginia.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. So I worked on the smallest scale of the experiments you'll hear about today, 2 small plot experiments exploring cover crop agronomy. And I find this diagram on the screen very helpful when discussing and talking about cover crops. And I'll often use it when we talk about cover crop performance. So cover crops are affected by the species we choose, the management decisions we make, such as seeding date or termination date. And then that's all relative to the location we're in. So how much rain we're getting, timing of a hard frost. And this triangle, of course, is modeled after the disease triangle in plants, where you need proper environment, host, and pathogen for the disease to exist. And in a similar vein, we need proper species, proper management decisions, and proper environment conditions. And they have to exist together for optimal cover crop performance. So my first experiment was a project looking at fall seeding of cover crops. And our question was very simple. How do cover crops seeded in the fall perform in Manitoba? And one way we viewed performance was biomass production in the fall. So you can see oat growth there on the left hand side of the screen, where we took biomass samples. And while the results from this experiment weren't surprising or revolutionary, we now have some added scientific data to talk about cover crop performance in Manitoba. And referencing back to our triangle, some of our conclusions were for species, our top fall performers in regards to biomass production were our cool season annuals. When we look at the management decisions, we know planting earlier in the fall means greater biomass production in the fall, and that will mean more ground cover the following spring. And then in regards to the location component, rains in the fall really helped us to achieve some cover crop biomass thresholds. So my second experiment looked at terminating a fall rye cover crop. So that fall rye would have been seeded in the fall, survived the winter, and started to regrow in the spring. And for management, we chemically terminated that rye at some extreme timings and some more conservative timings. So we looked at kind of the standard recommendation of 2 weeks before planting a test crop of either soybean or edible bean. But we also looked at 4 days before planting, 1 day after planting, and then kind of an extreme dire case of 2 weeks after planting that test crop. And one way we measured performance in this experiment was looking at spring ground cover by the cover crop. And you can see what that ground cover looked like at test crop planting for those different termination treatments. So I'm very interested in the topic of cover crops here in Manitoba because of all the unique challenges that our previous speakers have talked about. We have such a short growing season, variability in environmental conditions. We can have wet to very dry, all in the same year. And then there's also a skepticism that comes along with, can cover crops actually achieve the benefits that they're often advertised to provide here in our location? But with these challenges comes optimism. We know we have these early adopters from a varied range of farms that have incorporated cover crops into their cropping systems. And I had a fantastic opportunity last winter with the Seine Roseau Watershed District to create a cover crop fact sheet. And I'm hoping that extension material like this is something we can keep revising and expanding on as we learn more. We're just at the beginning of our cover crop knowledge here in Manitoba.
Thank you for that, Virginia. And it's great to really hear these three different scopes of work all kind of go hand in hand. You have the regional approach and differences in Callum's work. We have heard from Dale about on-farm work, and now from Virginia about more plot scale work and our interactions with stakeholders. So I'd like to bring everybody in now and maybe chat a little bit further at the same time, invite others in our audience to submit questions, and we'll try to field them as we go forward. Stakeholders in your work. Callum talked about policymakers and his interaction with CAPI. Dale on farm, obviously Virginia's worked in the watershed and prepared those extension documents. And Yvonne has been in the field for a long time, working with different stakeholders. So if I could start maybe with Callum, what was the reaction from the stakeholders to your work? Can you share some of your the responses you've received from your interactions?
Wow. Well, I'd say for the most part, it's been overwhelmingly positive. I think from a lot of the farmers, at least when it comes to cover crops, a lot of the farmers going back they felt quite often that there wasn't a lot of research out there being done for cover crops on the prairies. So for a lot of farmers, they were really eager to engage with me and really eager to hear back what other farmers are doing so that they could kind of benchmark and just get new ideas. But I think a lot of researchers and policymakers as well, and other people in the industry, what they really wanted to do is just get a bird's eye view of kind of what's happening. And for a lot of agronomists and other people who are really just starting out and learning about cover crops, they kind of wanted something which would just give them a quick insight so that they could really understand what's going on. And I think they've loved it as a first step. And also hopefully how they can guide and go from there.
Awesome. And Dale, the farmers you work with on farm, what were kind of their reactions to your work? Obviously, they must have been supportive having you on their farms, but just the outcomes of your work, the general feeling you had working with them. What's your feedback on that?
Yeah, it was great to connect with the farmers through this on-farm research. Yeah, it was great to get their perspectives on cover crops themselves. At the end of the 3-year period of research, some of the farmers are still very positive towards cover crops, and others are kind of taking a step back and just kind of reevaluating their future plans with them. So it's kind of interesting to see the two different reactions, but it's just based off their personal experience with cover crops. And some of the farmers that dealt with some larger yield losses from cover crops, it's going to really affect their perspective of adopting cover crops and increasing the acres on their farm. So
yeah, that makes sense, right? If you're taking a yield penalty and there's no incentives maybe that help you out with that gap, it's going to be difficult to change practices. So that's a natural reaction, I would say. But it's great that you were able to be on farm and explore that together. Virginia, from your perspective, you said you prepared some fact sheets and distributed them to certain stakeholders. Did you get some reactions from them? How did that go for you?
Yeah, this has been such a positive opportunity that I received being able to create these fact sheets. And I think it just goes to show, like, Callum, Dale, and I have had such different experiences with such different organizations. And it really is really telling that all of these different groups are interested in what we're doing. That's been such a positive experience.
Great. You know, it's such a hot topic nowadays when you talk about, climate change mitigation or carbon sequestration. Cover crops come up in different venues at different times, and maybe I can get Yvonne's reaction to that as well. Overall kind of stakeholder engagement in this area. You mentioned it's an exciting place to be at the moment as a researcher. So did you want to comment on kind of stakeholder reaction overall to your work?
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the real motivating things about working in this area, especially during the pandemic when research was hard and, it just took a lot of effort to try and be able to accomplish some things that we really took for granted as easy before the pandemic. So having so much engagement from farmers, from agronomists and policymakers in the results of our research, even as they were ongoing, was definitely very motivating, and kind of knew that you're working in the right area, asking the right questions at this time. As a researcher, I really benefited from the feedback from all these different avenues of research. Certainly the survey was very eye-opening in the volume, like the number of people that responded from the survey, as Callum mentioned, just how diverse the locations and farm types were. But also, we left space in the survey for people to comment and write, what are the pressing questions that they have. Certainly we had survey questions asking about what challenges and barriers they faced. So a lot of those are feeding back into my research program right now, and the conversations that I have with other scientists, being able to share these reports, share this information to grow the community of people that are working in this area of soil health and crop management. The on-farm research, I really appreciated, especially, during the pandemic when things were so isolated, having the one-on-one conversations with our on-farm collaborators, talking with them about, well, what cover crop are we going to grow next fall? It's been really dry. Are we going to do this? Or are we not going to do this? What's the next crop going to be in your rotation? Having those conversations with farmers about, and just sort of witnessing their thinking about how they were going to approach what treatment we were going to do next, and then seeing how that thought process changed over time as they had more experience with cover crops was also really informative for me and my students working in this area. We had lots of conversations in the lab group about the on-farm project and it certainly influenced what we were doing in our small plot work at the Carmen or Lindley Research Farm. So I think that the engagement has been really helpful, and it takes time and effort to make that connection, but I think it's really important as scientists that we take that time to do it so that we're on track, asking those important questions, asking the right questions.
Right. And, you can clearly tell there's significant interest, wide scale interest from all kinds of parties. You had all those interactions with the press in different ways, and that just speaks to the value of that work and how thirsty people are for that kind of knowledge. So that's great to see. What I noticed amongst the three students is your interaction with outside parties as you were getting this training, not just at the university, but Callum mentioned his interaction with CAPI, with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Dale is the research affiliate at the AAFC, and Virginia with the Seine Roseau Watershed District. Can you speak to me a little bit about how that added value to your training and to your way of thinking? Maybe let's start with Virginia. How did those interactions help you overall?
Yeah, well, creating extension material has greatly improved my communication and presentation skills, I think. Learning how to take my scientific data and minimize it or make it in usable chunks for people to consume. And another opportunity that I got through working with this extension material is just being exposed to different organizations that I never would have thought would be connected to my project.
We'll have to bring you in to talk to our people, because that's the biggest difficulty we have. Get our science to speak in lay terms, make them understandable. So it's a great skill to have. Dale, did you want to speak to your experience as a research affiliate with AFC, how that helped you overall?
Yeah, it was a very valuable experience for sure. We're very lucky, myself and Yvonne, to connect with Janzen, who's a senior economist at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And that's kind of how we became exposed to this research affiliate program. And it seemed like a really good fit for my program as a still in my studies. And it really was. I've now concluded that portion now. But with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, I was able to help develop some technical reports on cover crops. And also present to their research and analysis directorate, and also produce some fact sheets that will more so on the economic side of things, which will be eventually disseminated through the Manitoba Association of Watersheds in partnership with Living Labs. And just being able to connect and network with all these different organizations, both provincially and on the federal level is really interesting. It's a very rewarding opportunity for sure.
Yeah, great opportunity. And, I think the economics piece is going to be something you're going to get asked about lots when it comes to these new practices, right? That at the end of the day, that's what farmers care about, and that's how they make their living. So I think your involvement there is critical. Callum, and you were with working more on policy, I understand, with some folks. So how was that experience for you? Was that new? How did you feel about the whole thing?
Oh, I thought it was tremendous. And the opportunity to meet with people in Canada who are very interested in the future of Canadian agriculture as regards to policy and quality research. I thought that was wonderful. And it really sort of taught me that your project in research, it's not really about you. It's got many different audiences. And I think it's all of my, at every stage of my project, not just with CAPI. So I have to make sure when I'm writing, like Virginia said, it has to be understood by the farmers, by researchers, and also by policymakers. So it really just realized that there's several different audiences who are interested and need quality data. And when you're writing, you need to understand exactly who those audiences are and try and make sure that you're answering what they want to know.
Yeah, fantastic. I think this has been a great conversation so far. I don't want to monopolize the group, really. Maybe open the floor up soon to some questions. But I think while we do that, and I'll wait for Crystal to upload some of these incoming questions. I know we have a few in the queue. Oh, there's one that popped up already. So maybe we'll start right off with audience questions. The first one comes, I don't have a name attached to it, but it asks about soil health parameters that were measured. I guess that might be more related to Dale and Virginia's work. Did you want to comment on that, Dale and Virginia? What kind of soil health parameters did you measure in your studies? So let's start with Dale first. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can speak to that. Yeah, so in my research, part of it was looking at the soil health. So to measure that, we had sent samples off to the University of Saskatchewan with Kate Congray's lab, where she performs the Saskatchewan Assessment of Soil Health. Now, this is a similar soil test to the Cornell Soil Health test, which is probably more commonly known as the Saskatchewan one's just kind of been developed in the last number of years. But within that, there's, I believe, 25 different soil parameters, which encapsulates all the biological, chemical, and physical properties of the soil. I'm sure I won't remember all of them, but some of them are like wet aggregate stability for physical, soil fertility is all built into that as well. And yeah, I can't list all 25 off the top of my head, but there's a lot. And if you just search Saskatchewan Soil Health Assessment, you can probably find some detailed parameters within that document there.
Yeah, no, that's great. And you mentioned that you developed an index from it that I guess determined if it's improving or not improving. So I think ultimately people would be interested in the overall soil health parameters, and those 25 probably make that up, right? Ultimately, those come together and give you a final number. So great. Actually, Virginia, did you do a soil health analysis in your work? I don't know exactly. I don't want to put you on the spot, but go ahead.
No, I didn't have a soil health component to my project. I was really looking at explanatory values for cover crop performance.
Okay, oh, that's good. All right, I'm going to move on to our next question. It comes from Nate. What is the greatest barrier for farmers when considering adopting cover crops into their cropping system? And I think that was mentioned in the survey, also mentioned, I think, a little bit by Dale too. But I'll open the floor. Who wants to speak to the greatest barriers they feel is in front of cover cropping?
I can add to some answers to that. And well, of course, the different barriers change a little bit depending on if the farmer is already curious into cover cropping versus if they already aren't that interested. But I'd say still both groups, the biggest challenges are still very much our prairie climate, whether that be the shortness of the growing season or the moisture challenges in the fall. But I think that for at least those that are already cover crop curious, it's actually the lack of information and not knowing where to get started are also very, very prominent. But there's dozens and dozens of different barriers, but really it's climatic factors, lack of information, and then it gets into more sort of fear of additional costs, and of course potentially extra labor, and also farmers maybe not so willing to add an extra layer of complexity into their cropping system.
Well, that's a great summary. Anybody else wants to jump in around the barriers? I mean, I think Callum summarized it really well, but can you think of any other factors that might hold us back in adopting this more wide scale? Yvonne, did you have any thoughts about this at all from your end?
I have one thing here.
Yeah,
more so on the technical assistance side of things. So support from agronomists is another huge factor for adoption of cover crops, and some future work by Yvonne, and I think Virginia played a role as well, maybe Callum, with the trusted advisor partnership.
Right.
I think will help address some of that issue with having those advisors in place for farmers considering adoption of cover crops.
No, that's great. Change is hard, right? And you need good advice, and you need to have some sense of security that it's going to work out. And I think knowledgeable people go a long way there. Well, thanks for that, Dale. I do want to jump on to the next question that's here, and this goes specific to Manitoba. What are the cover crops grown here by farmers in the Inner Lake area of Manitoba? Anybody knows the answer to that?
Oh, that's very, very specific to one particular region. I think as well that it depends what sort of cover crop we're talking about, because that's another sort of thing in my research, in that when we talk cover crop, we have to break it down and whether we're talking about shoulder season cover crops and whether we're talking about full season cover crops. And then it kind of also depends on whether we're grazing or not. For Manitoba, if we're looking about establishing in the fall, so really to try and cover the soil after harvest, and we're not grazing, it's simple cover crops. And a lot of them are annual grains or other common crops that you already see on the prairies. So, but really, fall rye, peas, barley, oats, buckwheat, radishes, those are some of the most common cover crops established in the fall. And most of the cover crops established in the fall are very simple, just one species mixes. But I think a lot of places in the Interlake as well, they're kind of fostering their either their regrowth or their volunteers as well as a cover crop.
Okay. Thanks for that, Callum. The next question goes, I think, to Dale, because it asks about the on-farm study and what crop species were used as a fall cover crop in your studies, Dale?
Yeah, so with my study, the farmers had complete control over what cover crops they're growing, and same with annual crops. So there's a huge list of them. Some farmers chose to grow cover crops that did not overwinter. So mostly with oats and peas, stuff like that were quite common. And then for the farmers that were comfortable with that cover crop overwintering and they'd have to terminate it in the following spring, those farmers were turning more to the fall rye.
Interesting. Okay, we do have another question here. It asks, have you looked at the farm management survey conducted by StatsCan? And based on the survey, Manitoba lags behind other prairie provinces. Do you know of that? And any comments on it? Why do you think that is?
I can speak to this one quickly. So yeah, the farm management survey, the first one or the last one I think that's like openly published for cover crop adoption levels is in 2017. There was another one in 2021. Those results have not been published yet, but they will be available at some point in the future. I've seen those as a AFC employee, but I haven't seen them out in public yet. So yeah.
You got the inside track there.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the really exciting things about Dale being in the research affiliate program is he got a chance to talk with the different groups within Ag Canada and the different researchers within Ag Canada about how they were utilizing and accessing information about cover crops. And that really helped me too, in that, you know, I had sort of a cursory knowledge of StatsCan surveys, and through Dale's involvement and through involvement with Janzen, they had invited me to come and talk about Callum's survey, about what we learned about the Prairie Cover Crop Survey. And so I got to talk with them about, you know, what sort of information I was looking for as a researcher from the Stats Canada survey. So it was an exciting opportunity through the dialogue and through the collaboration to understand better what they were planning for in their next surveys. And as Dale mentioned, we're looking forward to having the release of the next series of survey data from Stats Canada. In terms of like, why is Manitoba lagging behind? I mean, I think we've touched a little bit on those different reasons. Part of it is environmental with, you know, as you move further west into the prairies and further north, we have shorter growing seasons. We have more limited moisture, but we also, you know, have this sort of knowledge and network limitation, right? So in Eastern Canada, in the US, there's just been more extension people and more communication about this practice for a longer period of time. And so I think in the prairies, as we look to, you know, bring perhaps a, you know, if there are these federal programs like the On-Farm Climate Action Program to all of Canada, we've got to take a look at, well, what resources are needed in addition to incentive payments to actually mobilize the adoption of these best management practices. And I think knowledge networks and resource materials are key to increasing the pace of adoption in Western Canada. In addition to, you know, the work that Virginia's doing in trying to find out what practices specifically can we start with as those, you know, easy starting places for success with cover crops. And Virginia and I had the opportunity to work with the Midwest Cover Crop Council in creating what a fact sheet for Manitoba in a series that they were calling cover crop recipes. So like if you were just getting started, what is that recipe that you would pick up and write? So we wrote a recipe for Manitoba on using fall rye ahead of soybeans based on her research project.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. You know, one thing when I was listening in that really surprised me is that response to that survey. 1,300 farmers or stakeholders responded to your survey across 4 provinces. You know, it's hard to get anybody to respond to any survey nowadays. Maybe it's COVID and people are bored, or some sitting at home doing nothing. I don't know how you got that many people to buy into your survey. And I noticed that 500 or so were, I think, in Western Canada, right? And the rest presumably are from parts of Ontario. So you got lots of buy-in from Ontario as well. So Callum, did you want to comment, or Yvonne, did you want to comment on how you were able to engage with that many stakeholders and what it took?
Mhm.
Did you have partners that allowed you to do that? How did you do it?
I'm gonna sneak in here, and I'm gonna say Yvonne had the right person for the job for that.
Fantastic. So, that's half the battle, right? Go ahead, Callum.
Yeah, I just think it became my life. And I think that utilizing networks, because there's a lot of great industry and extension networks. So that was one of the methods that we used. We contacted various different producer groups, and many of them were happy to put out and promote our survey. In Ontario, we managed to collaborate with the Ontario Cover Crop Steering Committee, which was made up with someone from the University of Guelph, someone from OMAFRA, someone from the Ontario Grain Producers. But then they went back and they had the committee also had several other groups, so they put it out. But also, I would reach out to the press, and they were very helpful with getting the survey out to farmers. We also, but I think the main way farmers heard about it was actually social media.
Okay.
So we would be putting out posts inviting farmers to take part. So that was a great way. And one thing I think it also just shows is during the pandemic, I think a lot of people were at home. I understand that farmers they're busy, but I do think that at least I was at home. I was able to get things out, so I think it was a perfect storm there. But I also just think where we were was farmers hadn't yet really engaged in any cover crop research, and I think they were eager to take part. I think if I would do another survey now, where people have already heard quite a lot about cover cropping on the prairies, I suspect we might get a little less engagement.
Right.
But really, it was just being constantly out there and just accessing those networks, but also just the fact farmers wanted to take part. I think those are the main things.
So good timing, and that Scottish resilience probably didn't hurt. So that's perfect. Oh, I love it. We are running out of time, but Yvonne, did you want to? I don't know if you wanted to jump in quickly as well, just for short period of time here we have left. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think Virginia was right. We had the right personalities, the right people. I think too, farmers are very supportive of people who are trying to learn, and graduate students certainly fall into that category, as well as, like collaborating with Dale in the on-farm project. So we really couldn't do this kind of research without farmers and agronomists partnering with us. And so I think the other thing is, that we were asking, and that we were approaching this from trying to understand what their experiences were. And so for me, the ability to act as a researcher, to collect that information, and then to present it in a way that's accessible both to farmers and to policymakers, and to help utilize and mobilize that data, I hope is a success story from this project, and also a real learning experience. It certainly made me rethink the way I want to approach agronomy research going forward. And so it certainly stretched me and my skill set as someone who traditionally, was trained in small plot agronomy to develop a survey. But I think the momentum and success of the survey is really helping me see the power of networks and what we can accomplish when we work together. So with that, I would love to say a few thank yous about those who helped make this research possible. Certainly the farmers that responded to our survey, to the farmers that invited us and collaborated with us in on-farm research. Thank you to them. Thank you to the many funders that you see on the slide who gave us the financial resources to make this kind of work possible. And I think you witnessed in this conversation today, the ability of graduate students and those that work with them to support them, the summer students, the technicians that are a part of my lab team. Thank you to all of you for making this research come to be. If you are interested in learning more about our research with cover crops, we have also utilized a new platform from the faculty, the MAKE website. And you can go to that website if you'd like to learn more about our reports. There are QR codes here that you can use to access our reports, as well as the fact sheet that we've created. There are some recorded webinars and other resources that we post about cover crops on the MAKE website. So utilize that resource there, and then you can continue to tune into that website as we release more information on cover crops for Manitoba and the prairies.
Well, great. That be out of time, unfortunately, today. What a great conversation, and thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Virginia, Dale, and Callum for participating in today's conversation. I certainly enjoyed it. This does conclude our conversation for this year, the conversation series, but we will be back in the fall with a whole host of new topics and people, and we look forward to having you join us then. In the meantime, please look out for notices on our social media accounts or by visiting makemanitoba.ca to make sure you are aware of the new events coming up. So with that, thank you, everybody, and have a great night.